Is Russia only 2 moves away from truly kicking off World War III? As the war in Ukraine enters its third year, tensions are high across Europe, and many NATO states are facing a tough decision. How much support can they give to Ukraine before Russia considers it a full-blown declaration of war? So far, 26 NATO countries have been vocally supporting Ukraine and have given billions in aid packages. But support in combat is much more a delicate issue. The UK, for example, has kept the number of British special forces sent to help with the war effort a secret, with its numbers only being confirmed in leaked security documents. According to that leak, the UK's contingent of special forces in the country numbers only about 50, with the US only having a presence of 14. The legitimacy of the leaks has been questioned, but if they are accurate numbers, it shows how cautious the other NATO countries are of being seen with troops in the region. Instead, most of the aid being sent by other countries to Ukraine has been in the form of security assistance, which includes soldier training and logistics support, and equipment such as weapons, armor, ammunition, and transport. Much of the foreign aid going to Ukraine also comes in the form of economic support, with the US having sent $34.2 billion, or 19.5% of their total Ukraine aid contribution. However, one country has recently stated clearly its intention to send boots on the ground, and you might be surprised to hear which country it is. In a recent interview, French President Emmanuel Macron reaffirmed his position on the war in Ukraine, stating he would send French troops to support Ukraine under the right circumstances. He stressed that while it's not the right time now, it's important for Western powers to take a firm stance against Russia and not show any weakness. To him, Russia's threat to the rest of Europe is existential. Macron stated that he was, quote, not ruling anything out. Because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out, we have undoubtedly been too hesitant by defining the limits of our action to someone who no longer has any limits and who is the aggressor. This quote might sound hyperbolic, but when you consider Putin's track record, you can't fault Macron for being cautious. 10 years ago, Russia seized Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, an event that many consider to be the real start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Back in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, Putin kept Western powers from bothering him by gently reminding them that Russia had nuclear weapons. This is a favorite tactic of Putin's, and he's played the nuclear card a number of times to dissuade other countries since the invasion in 2022. Putin has been unwavering in his quest to take Ukraine, which in his mind is a life-or-death struggle to preserve Russian culture, as well as a selfish attempt at bolstering his own legacy and Soviet-era geopolitical nostalgia. So naturally, when Putin heard what Macron was saying, he wasn't exactly thrilled. The Russian president called his French counterpart in late April 2023, and according to sources in the Élysée Palace, relations aren't looking good. The source was quoted in a CNN article saying, "The conversation is, unfortunately, an occasion to hear that President Putin will continue military interventions and go all the way, and ominously, the worst is yet to come." Meanwhile, Russian state news had a slightly softer recounting of the events, describing the call as a frank exchange of views on the situation around Ukraine. The two sides have agreed to keep the door open for future debate. But given that the French source also alleges that Putin flat-out denied bombing Kyiv, we can see why Macron has said that real diplomacy can't happen under Russian control. So if it's not the right time to send troops now, when would be the right time? According to Macron, given his statement, 2 things would have to happen for France to support Ukraine on the battlefield. 1, Russia would have to break through the front lines, and 2, Ukraine would have to ask for their help directly and unambiguously. To understand Macron's statement, we should first look at what it might take for Russia to gain an advantage against Ukraine and break through the front line. Despite some roadblocks during the first 2 years of the war, experts warn that a Russian breakthrough is entirely possible in 2024. Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the UK Joint Forces, explained in an interview with the BBC that there may be a serious risk for Ukraine as Russia gears up for a summer offensive. This is because, despite the amount of support Ukraine has received from other NATO member states, the size differential between Ukraine and Russia is still too big to ensure a Ukraine victory, even with the right military aid being sent over. Russia is, geographically speaking, the biggest country on Earth, and it has the world's second largest military, according to the Global Firepower Ranking. Even as hundreds of Russians have left the country since 2022 to avoid being caught up in the conflict, the Russian military still outnumbers the Ukrainian one by 5-1, according to Sir Barrons. The other thing Russia has going for them in the conflict is that, as the ones who fired the first shot, so to speak, they have had an advantage when it comes to claiming territory. So far, the pace of the war has been Russia's choosing territory to commit soldiers to, and Ukraine having to react to Russia's actions. Dr. Jack Watling, senior researcher at the Royal United Services Institute, told the BBC that it's a very long front line, and Ukrainians need to be able to defend all of it. It goes without saying that this is a monumental task, especially since the Russians have been absolutely brutal in this conflict, employing what ABC's Philip Clark calls basically scorched earth tactics. On top of all that, Russia has had a huge boost in equipment quality over the last couple months. One notable weapon that's proved to be a game changer is the FAB glide bomb, which is an adapted Soviet-era bomb refitted with fins, GPS tracking, and 1,500 kilograms of explosives. Ukraine's been left more vulnerable than usual to these attacks since recently there's been some delays in getting NATO aid packages to the front lines. Previous aid packages have proved vital in the war up to this point, and while new aid packages have been sent, the question remains whether or not it'll be too little too late to regain territory from Russia. It's clear to see then why Ukraine might be asking for help from some countries like France in the near future. Russia is an overwhelming force for Ukraine to be up against, with a seemingly endless amount of manpower to throw at the conflict. Sir Barons has warned that while it's not that way now, Ukraine could very well start to suffer a psychological loss and come to feel it can't win. And when it gets to that point, why will people want to fight and die any longer just to defend the indefensible? One of Russia's key goals in the war is to breach the administrative borders of the Donetsk Oblast. They maintain that eastern Ukraine is a historical part of Russia, and they've been gaining a foothold in the region over the past 10 years. While in previous years their goal of reaching Donetsk has seemed impossible, the past year has seen huge strategic gains by Russian units across the eastern part of the country. At the moment, Ukraine's success hinges on holding the city of Chasiv Yar. The city would be a huge strategic advantage to Russia. It would allow for attack from both the north and the south, and would block off a significant chunk of Ukrainian territory. If Russia takes Chasiv Yar, it's likely that surrounding cities like Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk would fall next. Here Russia is using a classic tactic that they've been employing since the Second World War, encircling the enemy on multiple fronts. This is worrying, not just to Ukraine but to the rest of Europe, as Russia has made it clear that they have no intentions of stopping with Ukraine. So Emmanuel Macron really wasn't exaggerating when he called Russia an existential threat. But why specifically does he think that Ukraine might come to France asking for help? Well, France has already been the third biggest supporter of Ukraine's war effort and has delivered a combined 2.6 billion euros of military equipment, including armor, anti-tank rockets, heavy artillery, vehicles, fuel, drones, transmission systems, explosives, and small arms. And as it turns out, France currently has one of Europe's most advanced militaries. Originally, NATO was hesitant to send their most sophisticated equipment to the front lines out of fear that Russia would see that as getting too involved. However, as the war grinds on and Russia's attacks heat up, more and more countries have shed that hesitation and started sending over the good stuff. The US has agreed to allow European countries to supply Ukraine with both US-made F-16 jets and the training required to pilot them. France, too, has been sending their high-tech weapons and transport. Naturally, Russia still has the French army beat in terms of manpower, but France's equipment is leagues more advanced than Russia's. For example, the most commonly used assault rifle in the French land army is the German-made HK-416F, a customized version of the HK-416 made specifically for the French army, which replaced the French-made FAMAS F1 in 2017. The HK-416F has an effective firing range of about 300 meters and fires at 917 meters per second. Contrast this with the standard-issue Russian-made AK-74, which has been in use by the Russian army since they were still the USSR. While it's received some tweaks and upgrades over the years, the revisions have been subtle, and its overall design and function haven't changed since the 70s. The AK-74 has a longer effective range at 500 meters, but its muzzle velocity is much slower than the HK-416F at 880 meters per second. For another example, let's look at tanks. France's land army currently has 215 AMX Leclerc battle tanks in service, which have composite titanium armor and have a max speed of 55 kilometers an hour off-road. They're armed with a 120mm tank gun and 2 machine guns. Originally designed in the 90s, these tanks are state-of-the-art, and their manufacturer Nextair Systems has sold them to Jordan and the UAE. Potential contracts are also being discussed with India, Croatia, and of course Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, mainly uses the Soviet-made T-series of tanks, most of which were designed during the time between the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, and they were only brought out of storage in the last couple of years to be used in the invasion of Ukraine. This pattern holds true to the majority of France and Russia's equipment. While France works with a variety of countries to ensure their battlefield tech is cutting edge, Russia seems to have the general mentality of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which, while cost-effective, is probably not the best philosophy to have in the rapidly changing landscape of modern warfare. France also might have significant strategic advantages against Russia. In 2021, the RAND Corporation's analysis of France's possible entry into the Russia-Ukraine conflict found that while France is fragile in some respects, such as low reserve troop numbers, their army is well prepared for joint operations and has strong political support, both of which would be key in a possible European conflict. However, the French army also has a few other vulnerabilities worth noting if Macron's grim prophecy comes true. Their reserves of munitions and troops wouldn't be sustainable for a long-term engagement. Despite any potential advantages France might have while aiding Ukraine, Macron's commitment to a military entente is proving controversial with other NATO member states. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's view of the situation has been the complete opposite of Macron's. Scholz claims that NATO's agreed that no ground troops would be sent from any member country and that any European troops in Ukraine were not participating actively in the war. Similarly, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that Poland had no plans to send troops to Ukraine. Similar statements have been made by the heads of state in countries like Slovakia, Spain, and Italy. On the other hand, the UK and the US have been more or less supportive of Macron's comments. Joe Biden has also never been one to hold back when sharing opinions on Putin, at various points calling him a bully, a butcher, and in a 2022 speech once said, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power." Much like with Macron's statements, the quote from Biden was seen by many world leaders as risky and escalatory. Despite that, he refused to walk back the statement, citing Putin's profound negative impact on international relations. The same day that Macron suggested sending troops to Ukraine, British Foreign Secretary David Cameron said that Ukraine had a right to use British long-range weapons to strike targets within Russia. Other NATO countries have balked at that statement, and Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called it very important and very dangerous. Even within France, Macron's statement has drawn fire from other politicians. Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu claims the French government had not come to a consensus when the discussion of military support came up during a conference on Ukraine. One quote Minister Lecornu gave to the Associated Press sums up the controversy pretty well. On the topic of providing training to Ukraine's troops, he said, "It's not sending troops to wage war against Russia." That is, in fact, probably the number one reason why the rest of NATO has disavowed Macron's comments. Nobody wants to poke the Russian bear any more than they already are. Regarding Macron's comment, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was quoted as saying, "In this case, we need to talk not about probability, but inevitability." So Russia's stance on the matter is loud and clear. Any NATO presence on the battlefield in Ukraine would be seen as a declaration of war. Despite this, Macron stood by his decision, even though it made him pretty unpopular with France's allies. Still, he's taken every opportunity to try to be diplomatic, from the phone call with Putin that we talked about earlier to trying to get China to talk some sense into Russia. On a recent visit to Europe, Chinese President Xi Jinping made a point to visit France and speak with Macron directly. This has given Xi a vital chance to hear France's side of the story. Despite Russia and China's close ties to each other, President Xi emphasized China is not going to directly participate in the conflict and that he intends to work closely with the international community to try to establish peace in Ukraine. According to a News.com article, Xi stated he wanted to find peace in Ukraine, even if analysts didn't expect any major changes in Chinese policy. Whether or not Xi's position could potentially have an effect on Putin's actions is hard to say at this point, but Macron stressed that getting China to weigh in on the conflict could prove vital. This is assuming that it would be possible for anyone to change Putin's mind on anything. He has been notoriously unreasonable in peace talks, piling on more and more demands at every possible chance. Now, after all this, you might still be thinking, of all the countries that could be making these bold claims and ruffling NATO feathers, why is it France? Well, when you look at France's military history, it makes perfect sense. Given France's position in World War II when it was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, it's easy to see why Macron is eager to adopt a more hawkish position in the face of potential Russian encroachment. Animosity between Russia and France is nothing new when we look at the history of the European geopolitics either. As far back as the Napoleonic era, the French and Russian empires fought for control over Central and Eastern Europe, culminating in the failed invasion of Russia by Napoleon in 1812. The next time those two powers clashed was in the 1850s, when France and Britain allied to defeat Russia in the Crimean War. For a brief period at the turn of the century, there was an uneasy peace between France and Russia as they formed a diplomatic alliance against Germany that lasted until the end of the First World War in 1918. Following that, France was unable to ally with Russia again due to being controlled by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Then in 1949, In the early years of the Cold War, France sided with the US and became one of the founding members of NATO. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, France and Russia signed a bilateral treaty in 1992, but the two countries have still never warmed up to each other. The closest thing to supporting Russia that France has done in the 21st century was when France agreed to sell Russia a fleet of Mistral-class amphibious assault ships in 2010, a deal which was heavily criticized and then canceled in 2015 after Russia invaded Crimea. If you were wondering, the warships meant to go to Russia in that deal ended up going to Egypt instead. But the biggest question of all is perhaps this. Let's say that Russia breaks through the front lines and makes it to Donetsk, and President Zelensky asks France for help. If Macron keeps his end of the promise and sends French troops east, that will mean a NATO country has officially waged war against Russia. What would happen then? Well, as we explained earlier, France's military is strong but small, and unable to wage war against Russia on its own. In order to defend itself, France might have to invoke Article 5, the article in the North Atlantic Treaty that allows a NATO member to call on the combined forces of other NATO members for support. This article has only ever been invoked once in the history of NATO, on September 11, 2001, in response to the New York and Washington, D.C. terror attacks. Just because France invokes Article 5 doesn't mean that all other NATO countries must send their armed forces to help with the conflict. It just means that the other countries have full permission to do so if they're willing and able. However, the likelihood of other NATO states coming to France and Ukraine's aid would increase significantly as soon as Russia made a move against a NATO member like they almost did in March 2022 when they fired rockets dangerously close to the border with Poland. To quote UK Health Secretary Sajid Javid, "If a single Russian towcap steps into NATO territory, there will be war. Countries closer to the center of the conflict, like Poland and Germany, would likely join first to defend their own borders alongside France and Ukraine." But despite David Cameron's statement about Ukraine's right to use British weapons to attack targets in Russia, most NATO heads of state agree that attacking Russia on their own turf would be a monumentally terrible idea. At the moment, Russia is the one on the offensive. But if NATO were to strike first in any situation, it would mark a major conflict escalation that Russia might respond to with chemical or even nuclear retaliation. This is probably what Putin was talking about when he ominously said that an attack on Russia would lead to, quote, "consequences you have never seen in history." Now check out why Russia is finally ready to use nukes, or watch this video instead.